Okay.
I think separate bedrooms could be the logical outcome.
It's 1 o'clock.
1 o'clock.
So we're going to start.
Oh, wow. Is it 1 o'clock?
And before we start, I have an important job for someone. I need an intern. Do I have any volunteers? One volunteer.
One volunteer.
Come on down.
You're the next contestant on the WizardCast.
You will need to sign a 5-page waiver. Okay.
And
the job is really simple. All right. Come on up stage because you will have one speaking line. Okay. Beyond that speaking line, you are responsible for these wonderful signs.
Oh my gosh.
So, at any time that you feel
the audience interaction portion of it.
that these lovely people out here aren't pulling their weight, and you want them to perform some action, you get to hold up that sign. I will allow you to sit in the front seat, though, so you don't have to stay on stage the entire time.
Did you give her the moon the stage sign? No, okay. No.
It's Groan.
Oh, that's what Groan is.
It's Groan.
That's the virtual moon
Wait,
the stage.
hang on. Brian, does that sign say Appluse?
It does.
No, it says a plus. Or a...
Brian...
Look, I didn't have enough room to put the second A on.
You know,
I don't have words.
I have a picture of workers lovingly stenciling "no praking" in letters 4 feet high on a freshly asphalted parking lot. You know,
Okay.
It was looking out of my office window. There they were. No P-R-A-K-I-A. Oh, please. You had one job.
All right. So now that we have our intern, Corinne, if you would kindly come up here, because I have one line that's very, very important for you to read.
WizardCast is recorded in front of a live studio audience.
Thank you, Corinne. Woo! I have to say, so far, this is the best any of our interns have ever done.
I know, right?
Okay. Since we're beginning... Here, take this. Thank you.
What? Why am I holding onto your phone?
It's okay. I'm going to phone it in.
Get up here. Get up here. Come on.
Do sight gags work on an audio medium?
Fine. Can we go on? Can we start?
Yes.
Can we
All
actually
right.
start the podcast
All right.
now?
So I did hear some great news from the EU.
Oh God. What? Okay. Good. They could use some good news. What is the news?
Well, I found out they have 1 GB of free space.
It took him a second, but he got it. Hey, they laughed.
They
laughed
laughed?
when she held up the sign.
You have the power.
All right. I think we should just start now.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. That's fine.
So this is where the intro music will play. We don't actually have it queued up. Does anybody know how the intro music sounds?
I don't even know how the
No,
intro
nobody
music
actually
sounds.
listens to this. All right.
That's... Hey, Midwest Dreamin', we're live!
Woo! Not the groan.
You have one...
Not the groan.
You have one job, Corinne.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We do have a very special episode for you today.
But before we start, we have to thank some of our sponsors, because without them, we would not be here today.
But here's the thing. We're not actually getting any money because these aren't actually real companies. They're fake
Look,
sponsors.
stop ruining the sponsor spot. We may never get a free ride to a conference again.
We had to pay to be here, Brian.
Today's sponsor is KAH Computers, makers of the serialized robots that will enslave the human race until our extinction. They have generously provided our live audience with special forehead stickers that, and they emphasize this, will not control your mind and turn you into a brainless zombie. So slap those stickers on your forehead and enjoy a life of mindless lack of worry and concern.
They are under your chairs. Go ahead. Look. They're... Okay, we got one person to look. This doesn't sound like a very good idea. Are you sure that the stickers won't turn them into mind control zombies?
No, KAH said that that's what Pokemon Go was for.
Oh, okay. Now I can see that.
So as Mark said, this is a very special episode for us.
Yes, it is, because we are live here at Midwest Dreamin'.
No. Well, yes, we are live at Midwest Dreamin',
Yes,
but
we are.
it's special because we have a special guest.
That's true. So let's introduce him.
Okay. Our guest today is frankly an amazing man. He was born to immigrant parents in 1492 while sailing across the ocean blue. He became a legendary frontiersman while exploring the uncharted wildernesses in 1823. He was brutally mauled by a bear. However, in retaliation, he mauled the bear right back. In 1985, he bravely used a time machine, which he invented, to go back to 1885, saving his assistant, Dr. Emmett Brown, from a runaway train. In 1920, he continued to be ahead of his time by co-founding the first cloud company, Salesforce.com, back when Salesforce was focused on seeding clouds with silver iodide to make it rain. Since then, he has his finger on the pulse of technology that our civilization has been surfing for the last 100 years. He's Mark's favorite person to listen to. He's the great Peter Coffey.
It would be difficult to describe my pleasure at this moment. Thank you, guys. It's great to be with you.
Awesome. Okay, so our first question, this is very important because I'm sure everybody here wants to know this. It's very important. It's very crucial, relevant to our modern lives right now, and that is, Peter Coffey, are you playing Pokemon Go? And if so, what team are you on?
I am not.
Oh. But okay, so what's your take on it? What is your take? Because it's
well,
blown up, right?
Full disclosure, since I am long on Apple, and they are getting a 30% cut of a very nice revenue stream, and the earnings announcement is coming up next week, I'm all in favor of it. I actually put this in the form of a Jeopardy answer question on Twitter the other day. What is 53% of all in-app purchasing behavior today? That would be everything other than Pokemon Go.
Wow.
On the Apple Store?
On July 10th, Pokemon Go represented 43% of all in-game purchasing activity for that day.
Which is kind of short of amazing. I've played it enough.
Yeah.
Groan?
Oh, is that
the
you?
Groan son.
That's just you.
But that's the thing. No, I haven't paid 1 cent.
Okay.
And the thing is, granted, I live in a relatively small city. There's not a huge, and I don't do a lot of walking. I live on the outskirts, so I have to drive everywhere. But there's a lot you can do in the game without having to pay 1 red cent. It's not like a lot of these games where you hit a wall and you just can't go any further with any sort of alacrity whatsoever unless you drop at least a few bucks. It doesn't force you into that.
What we're seeing is one of those things where, a community norm emerges and people compete against friends. It is a very social thing. I mean, we make jokes about it turns people into mindless zombies, but they're wandering around in packs in many cases, or at least in teams of 2 or more.
Mark wouldn't know anything about that.
No, that did not happen with the MVPs the other night. No.
But the other thing that I'm noticing is how quickly it's being commercialized by people like automobile dealers who will bring people into the showroom with it. I mean, it's becoming the new candy house in the forest that gets Hansel and Gretel to come and explore the inside of the oven. I mean, really,
That's kind of a bad metaphor.
Oh, well, is it?
Do you really want the children to be eaten or the witch to go into the oven?
I'm not making a value judgment here. I'm just saying that the ability to use this new mode of interaction with a prospective customer to get them at least to come in and look at what you've got, it's a remarkable thing.
Well, the funny thing about it is the tool that they're using within the game to actually bring people in is very appropriately called a lure.
Yes.
It's supposed to be luring the Pokemon to a specific place so you can go pick them up, but its effect is luring people to the place.
Yeah, and it's a medium. It's a creative medium, and like any good platform, it will be used in ways that weren't immediately obvious. So am I saying that Pokemon Go is a platform? Yeah, platform used to be a technology term. It used to be server operating system database. That was a platform. Well, if you're the people who came up with the Taxi Later app for scheduling rides on Uber in advance, Uber is your platform, and you've created value above that level. And that's really the most interesting conversations that are being had now is what's the highest level yet at which you can begin creating new value because someone else is taking care of all the things that are below that.
Right.
And that level is rising all the time. It has been rising dramatically over the last few years.
In effect, anything with an API could be thought of and treated as a platform if
that's absolutely right. Yeah, that's absolutely correct, and that's why anything you create today should be realized as a bundle of APIs first, and then what a retired CIO at Caterpillar called your serving suggestion might be your product. But if you begin by conceiving it as a platform and then demonstrate what can be done with it, this is actually something that we talk about with customers at Salesforce to say, don't think of this as a CRM with some extension tools that we call a platform. Think of it as a platform on which, just as an existence proof, we happen to have built the world's leading CRM and the world's leading service and support solution and the world's leading, et cetera, et cetera. Well, those are 4 or 5 of the several thousand or million, depending on how you count them, applications that have now been written on that platform that we did not write. And that's a revelation to people because they realize that without really thinking about it, they'd thought of platform as an extensibility toolkit for the app. which is almost exactly inside out from what's, in my opinion, the better truth.
So I'm going to keep going with this Pokemon Go line for
Go
just a
for
little
it.
bit
Go
longer
for it.
because it is very interesting what it's doing
Yeah.
to society and to, our news cycle is blowing up because of it. Either people are going out of their way, outlets are going out of their way to either find something bad about it or just to talk about it, just to drive traffic. But there was a quote actually from Oliver Stone yesterday at San Diego Comic-Con.
Which one of the pocket robots killed JFK?
That's kind of where he was going with it.
Okay.
But more along the lines that he believes it is driving a totalitarian state, that it is enabling the surveillance infrastructure to come down upon us.
It's giving us another thing we'll do that provides location and behavior metadata as a side effect.
And potentially side hacking into cameras and microphones.
What a lovely thought.
I know.
Yeah. I hadn't been quite that apocalyptic about it, but he's, of course, completely accurate.
Well, I think it's not just Pokemon Go. I had a conversation with a group of my college buddies that they were completely freaked out that they had their smartphones sitting on the desk where the little girls started coming up and talking about Kitty, which was the name of their stuffed animal.
Yeah.
And suddenly they start getting all these tidy cat litter ads showing up on Facebook.
Yeah. Well, there was a study
that's
done, I think it was done at MIT fairly recently,
Groan sign, yeah.
where they showed that with, I think if I remember right, and I tweeted about this, but I think they said that with 5 anonymous pieces of metadata, you can triangulate pretty quickly to a specific human being.
Right.
And that's even if you don't have, name stuff. I remember the only time in my life that I've ever called in to a call-in radio program was when there were street cameras being introduced in Santa Monica. And someone from, if I remember correctly, the ACLU, I think it was the ACLU and not just something of that genre, was talking about this massive violation of privacy. And I'm afraid I became somewhat impatient and called and said, look, if you wear a broad-brimmed hat and sunglasses, you can make it tremendously difficult and expensive for someone to figure out if that's really you going from camera to camera to camera. But if I've got your credit card number and your phone number, I don't just know you went into that bookstore, I know what books you bought. If you're worried about privacy, it's way cheaper to find out things about you through existing means without needing to conjure up anything as elaborate as the things that get people excited. So the bright, shiny threats to privacy are actually distracting people from the pervasive and much more cost-effective ways that I can study people's behavior
Well, it's
already.
like the story that I always heard as an example was Target sending out
Yes.
a mailer to this gentleman's, I think it was 16-year-old daughter for baby stuff. And the guy got really upset thinking, my daughter's not pregnant.
Came
Why are you
storming
sending
in
her this
saying,
stuff?
why are you trying to encourage my daughter to become pregnant?
Right. Got really angry and then came back and apologized because it turned out his daughter was pregnant.
Right.
And she had been shopping the stuff online.
Yes. Now, there are 2 key epilogues to that story. One of them is the question of, why did Target invest a considerable amount of data science effort in figuring out how do we predict that someone is about to become a first-time parent? Because it turns out that they've done some research and they found that there are a relatively small number of moments in your life when your behavior can be changed in ways that are quite durable. And the moment of becoming a parent is one where all of a sudden, instead of being prepared to shop the cool deals at 5 or 6 places over a week, the ability to go to a one-stop shop suddenly becomes very important to you. And if you can capture people at that fork in the road in their lives of, now I'm a parent and now being able to get it all at Target is really going to matter to me, it's a very high leverage moment to capture a revenue stream from a customer who may be with you for decades. So that answers one question, which is, why did Target try so hard to do that one particular thing? Because that's a very high leverage moment for customer capture. The second thing is, what did Target learn from this? They learned, don't send out advertising flyers consisting of nothing but prospective parent stuff. Make sure that there's some motor oil, garden hoses, and step ladders in there.
Make it seem right.
But make it seem heavily seed it with parent-related stuff, but don't cross the creepiness threshold by making it totally obvious that you know what's going on. And so they learned we learned one thing about Target. Why was this so important to them? But they learned, don't be so blatantly obvious about it that it gets people creeped out. But you can still take advantage of the data, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't make people feel spied upon.
It's okay to be creepy as long as you hide it.
It's all about customer
But
experience.
that's the assumption, right?
It's ultimately it's all about customer experience, is what it really says.
Well,
If you give people an uncomfortable experience, it doesn't matter why you did it. It doesn't matter they had a good reason for doing it. People are uncomfortable; they're uncomfortable.
Well, it's also about customer experience does also include the idea of, to a degree, that which is also known as marketing, but that is also fooling the customer.
Yeah.
To a degree, it's metaphorical astroturf. It looks organic.
Yeah.
But it's not. And there's that degree of misleading you have to do in order to get that pushed across.
And there's
not freak
nothing
people
novel
out.
about that. It's not as if there are pictures of slaughterhouses on the doors of McDonald's. It's not
That
as
would
if we
be
have actual
appetizing.
documentary footage of an airplane crash when we're trying to persuade people to buckle up in the plane. We've got the idea that we need to present to people, this is what we need you to do, without necessarily giving them all the details. So that's not a novel idea, but we just have to bring those things we've learned about how to do business for years into a new domain.
And it does require, to a certain degree, an astronomical amount of trust being placed in businesses.
That is
Because
probably the
sheer
biggest
amount.
difference now, because
Yeah.
if you make a money mistake, you can fix it. I can give you a credit. I can have a big sign saying, if you find it cheaper somewhere else, we'll give you twice the difference. I can promise that. If there's a breach of data or even
Which happen regularly.
Yeah, if there's a breach of data or, far worse, a release of incorrect data, well, are you familiar with the term Streisand effect?
No, actually.
Okay. There was an aerial survey of the California coastline that produced high-resolution images of the entire coastline, including Barbra Streisand's backyard. She was not pleased to have a high-resolution photo of her backyard online and complained. And I can understand perfectly, because at this point, at least 10 people had looked at it.
Yeah.
You know what happened next. The act of publicly complaining about this increased the number of views of her backyard by multiple orders of magnitude. And if you go look at Wikipedia, you'll find there's a page on this thing called Streisand effect with dozens and dozens of examples of an effort to contain or correct a data breach, hugely multiplying the impact of the breach. You can't fix it.
Mark,
Schrodinger's security breach.
I
Almost.
got it.
Oh, way
okay?
past that, yeah.
So we're going to post the podcast for this episode, and then we're going to tweet out whatever you do. Don't listen to it. It's terribly embarrassing to us.
But that does work.
That would work.
I mean, the same
That
thing
would
works
work.
with, okay, this is going to make me look bad.
Podcast shocker.
This is going to make me
It's
look
a bad
bad.
control, though, because
it's a
it's
pickup
you.
artist move.
Yeah.
So
It's a pickup artist move. It's called negging, where you
Negging.
essentially if you're talking to a woman, you want to get her attention, you basically make it sound like you're actually not that interested, or you make some sort of allusion to the fact that maybe her shoes don't look that good or something like that. And it's supposedly what it does is it increases the amount of attention and interest they have in you. Don't ask me how I know this. I read random things on the internet.
You scared me.
So does at least one presidential candidate. But, but I've been having been married for 3 or 4 decades now. I really have completely forgotten anything I ever knew about this. Anyway,
Okay.
I've been married for 8 years, but oh god, my wife's going to hear it and she's going to think horribly things of me.
especially after
My
I
wife
tweet
always
this.
thinks horrible things of me. All right, let's bring the conversation a little bit back to Salesforce, because we are at
We
a
can do that.
Salesforce conference,
Okay.
and I know you always
Well,
talk...
then that means we're going to talk about customer success, because that's the only topic on our minds.
I bet.
She's
Well,
trying. She's holding up the
she's
signs
trying.
and nobody's doing anything.
Pay attention to the intern.
Applause.
Yes. Yes.
Give her an A+. Yeah, right.
Well, then she'll have the extra A for applause.
Right.
So you often talk about what's going on in the future, how the system is changing.
Yes.
What skills and knowledge sets do you think the admins and devs of the world need to learn in order to prepare for that evolving ecosystem?
And maybe more than just admins and devs, anybody in the ecosystem.
True.
Yeah.
What should I be teaching my children?
Well, to jump in the time machine, the keynote I gave here last year, in fact, concluded with 3 or 4 slides on this notion that the things you used to take a class or get a certification to do are increasingly going to be taken over. I counsel high school students on STEM, academic major choice. One of the things I started using this year was a screenshot of the Wolfram Alpha website, which is a natural language front end to the Wolfram mathematical tools. And the example that I used, because it was one of the first things I ever did on Wolfram Alpha, a friend of mine was taking a college statistics class. She was working on the mathematics of what are the odds of drawing a full house in 5-card poker. And we were just talking about that, and it just occurred to me to wonder, what would Wolfram do with that? So I just typed in the question, what are the odds of drawing a full house? No context, nothing else. It immediately understood that the phrase full house was most likely a reference to poker.
Versus the TV show.
It defaulted to 5-card draw, but allowed me to override that default if I chose. It gave me the answer as a decimal approximation, as an exact fraction, and allowed me to expand its calculation to several successive layers of depth if I really wanted to see how it had done that, all with a completely context-free natural language question. Now, that used to be a 1-level or 2-level college probability class to do that. Now it's a free website.
And how many poker games have you won since?
I don't usually play poker, but that's all right. I once had someone try to bluff me when I was holding kings and aces in a full house, and I have never recovered from how good it felt to smack down his lousy
Go out on a
two-pair.
high.
And since the average is bound to go down, I stopped playing after that game in high school. I knew I'd never have a better poker experience than that. So, but the point that I'm making to the high school students is that merely being able to execute calculations and merely mastering facts, well, I'm sorry, that's just not going to be economic value creation anymore. It's going to be your ability to triangulate on several different disciplines and your ability to be a collaborator and a value adder in a group. I have the experience of working with some universities on defining new major programs in things like analytics and big data. And to their credit, the University of Montana at Missoula, when I got together with them, without my saying anything about it, the people who were in the room were from the math, computer science, business, and, wait for it, visual arts departments. Because they'd already figured out that being able to present data in a way that allows people to grasp what is significant in a glance and not have to look at a table of numbers, that's actually one of the keys to getting any value out of this stuff. That's not a combination of talents that's in any one of those departments, and so it's clear that we can't just let the math department say, well, this is a form of statistics, so we'll run the big data program. Being able to say, we really need to be prepared to combine points of view from what have previously been considered separate disciplines to create a new discipline like data-driven decision-making, like data-driven user behavior guidance. I mean, at that point, it's psychology. And maybe you've been in the room sometimes when I've said, if you got into IT because you just don't like dealing with people, I have some very uncomfortable news for you.
Everybody uses IT.
You're now all essentially forensic psychologists. Your job is not to make the system do what it's supposed to do. Your job is to figure out why, even when the system is not buggy, the users are not getting the results they want. And it's a very engineering attitude to say, well, the users are doing it wrong. If the wrong thing was easier to do than the right thing, then that's now a system design error, and we can't just keep saying, well, it's the user's fault they didn't read the instructions. People aren't supposed to have to read instructions anymore. They kind of know that something like an iPhone is meant to be discoverable. In fact, it doesn't even come with a manual. You're kind of expected to navigate through it. 2
pages that show how to plug it in, like pictures, and that's it.
Yeah, and those are pretty much required because of the electrical safety rules.
Yeah.
The idea that you'll break it while trying to figure out how it works, that's a very old-fashioned idea. We were talking with someone earlier about how do you teach programming today. Well, if you remember building things like a .NET application with tools like C++, one misplaced semicolon could lead to complete inability to even find yourself at a point where you can begin to figure out what happened. Someone once said the problem with languages like that is that if anything goes wrong, you're the arson inspector looking for the match. There's nothing, the system can't tell you where it hurts because your one mistake made it, comatose or worse. What we found out with tools like HTML, now that's not a programming language strictly speaking, but if you expose school-age children to HTML as their first, if you will, formal language to be understood by a machine, the beauty of HTML is you're going to get something. The page may be ugly. The page may have the HTML instead of the behavior because you forgot to put a closed bracket on it or something, but the misbehavior will be informative misbehavior and will guide you toward solution. This is something that John Gall once talked about. He wrote a book called Systemantics, which is a deliberate pun, obviously, on semantics, and also on the idea that systems display antics, as in systems do weird and strange things. But in the real world, most systems spend most of their time not working perfectly. And systems that are either working perfectly or not working at all are really not very useful. You need systems that can tolerate degrees of imperfection and still do mostly the right thing. In fact, this is something I'll mention in my keynote this afternoon. There's a chip being worked on at MIT now that does things like image processing roughly 100 times as fast with roughly 1/10 or 1/100th the power by not being exactly right. But with image processing, mathematical perfection isn't actually what you want. When if you've got 64 bits to represent a color, having the least significant bit be on or off is really not very important. Well, it turns out that this approximation-based computing is really energy efficient to do. It's just very counterintuitive to people who think the job of computers is to do it perfectly. Well, if you're doing image processing, maybe not so much.
That's not so big of a deal. If you were calculating like how many square feet you need this particular highway to be, you want that to be accurate.
Not to the square millimeter.
Well, that's true.
That's
true.
And
so save it for orbital calculations.
Well, the point I'm making is we tend to move forward from the technology instead of backward from the need. And we're going to spend more and more time doing the sit-along, the ride-along, the interview with the customer, really understanding what are you trying to get done here, because there's a rule that I think I'm going to put on a t-shirt someday, which is good enough sooner than needed is infinitely better than perfect too late to be useful. That doesn't really fit on a t-shirt, but the problem is we've got years and years of thinking that IT needs to be perfect or it's wrong, with the result that most IT projects have either worked perfectly or not at all and have generally been delivered late and over budget. And all of those are expectations that we should not continue to tolerate. The idea that it's going to be good enough because I actually spoke to the user and I understand what it is they're trying to accomplish. If the answer is going to be red or blue, then I don't really need to worry about sky blue, cerulean blue, or navy blue. I just need, is it a red or blue? And overworking the problem, unfortunately, is something we've gotten very, very good at doing because the technology encourages us to overwork the problem. One of the best stories on this is the CIO at Franklin Covey. Have either of you guys ever used a paper day planner?
Yeah.
Okay,
a long
fine.
time ago.
All right.
I still do.
All right. Well, the CIO at Franklin Covey loves this story, and I love sharing it. When he came to work for the company, every year the annual report had mentioned improved order fulfillment time as one of their metrics that they had accomplished that year. They'd gone from 90% of orders shipped within 2 weeks to 90% first week, 90% within 3 days, and so on. And it occurred to him, because he wasn't just going to chase the rabbit of the metric, is there some point at which it stops being cost-effective to make the order fulfillment time any faster? Well, then he did something very reasonable. He went and looked at the user experience. When do you order your refills for next year's calendar pages? When you turn the page for the last of your 12 months, it says, don't forget to order your refills this month. Turns out that an actual study showed that 90% of the orders came in at least 3 weeks before the customer needed them, 99% at least 2 weeks before the customer needed them, and arguably anything that had ever been spent on reducing order fulfillment time below 10 days had been an absolute complete waste of money from any perceived value at the customer side. But they'd been chasing the rabbit of an IT, hard, crisp, quantifiable metric.
Faster is better.
Yeah. They'd say they were able to proudly say we're a metrics-driven company with relentless improvement of service is our constant goal, except that they were no longer getting any value whatsoever from what did Vala Afshar this morning say? The customer's perception of your service is a big factor in your quality. And that phrase, the idea that it's the customer's perception of it instead of an engineer's measure of it, well, that's a novel idea to a lot of people who've come into IT through essentially a technical pathway instead of coming in from, say, marketing or psychology. So I think if there's one big difference, just to get back to your question, what does the successful IT person of the future need to be? They need to be people who really are beginning from a definition of the problem based on what is a person trying to accomplish here, and not a definition of the problem of what's the gap between perfection and reality that we're trying to close with technical accomplishment here?
So essentially, we should all become user experience experts.
We all are. I mean, you
Have to be at this point.
Application design takes an activity that the business has to perform, automates it, and declares victory. That's what applications have traditionally done. The problem with that is that delivering the application that runs on a PC, the application that runs on a tablet, the application that runs on a watch, and the application that runs on a voice synthesizer in your connected car, well, now those look like 4 or 5, I lost count, separate work products. Well, let's turn that around and say, what's the user experience we're trying to provide here? At which point you realize, there are aspects of that experience that are going to be experienced while I'm driving, aspects while I'm glancing at my watch, aspects while I'm looking at the war room screen. And you find yourself thinking about the process as the center of your conversation. And what we used to call the application, well, that's just ways of rendering interaction with that experience. But you're designing the user experience and then manifesting pieces of that experience on different devices. That's completely different from the way you did, for example, Visual Basic, which fatally warped the brain of an entire generation of programmers because step 1 was design the user interface. Step 2 was add behavior, which means that as soon as you had to move to another device, step 1 was start the whole thing over again. Because all of your logic was tightly coupled to that interface you'd built, which was tightly coupled to a specific kind of display that you were trying to support. What we need to be doing instead is saying, okay, what are the data objects here? What's the language of those objects? A customer object should be able to support certain kinds of behavior, a warehouse object, whatever. And then when I'm doing that experience, what pieces of that do I need to be able to do with a tap on my watch? What pieces do I need to be able to do with a maximum of 4 things shown on the screen of a phone? You are at that point an experienced designer relying on hardware to deliver that experience instead of a user interface designer tightly coupled to hardware before you even start thinking about why you're doing it at all. And that's just a different sensibility of what being an IT person is.
So I want to backtrack, actually. One of the things that you mentioned earlier was this idea of what we need to have as IT personnel.
Yep.
And this is something that is becoming, as time goes on, as technology advances, more and more of a kind of a global issue, because we have the advent of robotics. We have the what will be the imminent, I'm sure, advent of digital personal assistants, and so much of what is the labor force now will, to a degree, become a sense of obsolete, and will create a widening gap of essentially the value of labor, the value of work. One of that immediately pops into my head is the movie Elysium. I don't know if you've seen it.
I've seen it.
Where you have this idea of kind of the elite
and
on
I
a station.
I thought their depiction of life in the class that still had a job at all, building and painting robots, was vivid and, in my mind, quite realistic.
Very visionary work, I thought.
Very I was disappointed that they weren't prepared to make it the 3-hour movie it deserved to be, because the wrap-up at the end, it seemed to me, was just a little bit too convenient.
True.
There was a tremendous amount of cultural evolution that took place in about 2 weeks there.
Yeah.
But the beginning, the depiction of what would life be like in a world where robots are pervasive, and if you're very, very lucky, you've got a job building the things. I thought that
and
was
even
quite
then,
well done.
you're low cast at that
yes,
point.
and this is, of course, exactly what Andy McAfee and Eric Brynjolfsson at MIT have written, both Race Against the Machine and the Third Machine Age, Second Industrial Revolution, I guess was the name of the thing. Maybe you've heard me quote Norbert Wiener on this, but in 1948, in the foreword to his book Cybernetics, at a time when there were probably only 5 machines in the world that you would recognize as computers, so this was an extraordinary piece of future casting, he said, the first industrial revolution, replacing muscles with machinery, made it infeasible for anyone to earn a living holding a shovel, because one man on a bulldozer can do the work of 60 people with shovels, and he doesn't cost anything like 60 times as much. Then he said, we are now embarked upon a second industrial revolution that will do for the routine work of the mind what the steam engine has done for the muscles. And here's the quote that just burned itself into my brain at roughly the age of 20 when I picked up this book at a used book sale and have had it near to hand ever since. He said, taking this second industrial revolution as accomplished, the average human being of mediocre attainments or less has nothing to sell that is worth anyone's money to buy.
Oh, that's
Which
a bit
for
harsh.
1948 is pretty amazing, and many people would say, we're kind of, if we aren't there yet, we can see it from here, because if you look at the speed with which people are being replaced by some combination of algorithms and robotics, it's happening quite quickly. And here we are in Chicago at Midwest Dreamin, where Booth School of Business at University of Chicago did a study maybe 3 or 4 years ago on something that hadn't occurred to me to triangulate. I was talking earlier about the need to look at several disciplines at once. They said, what's the impact on robotics taking over jobs when the cost of capital after the global financial crisis goes to practically zero? Because as you know, the interest rate on loans now is practically nothing, right? Well, it turns out that when you can borrow the money to buy the robot at practically no interest cost, you do it a lot more quickly. And they looked across many different industries, many different geographies, and said, you know what? The substitution of capital for labor has hugely accelerated because of the blowback of now I can borrow the money for practically nothing. So the question, and this is what Eric and Andy at MIT have been focusing on, is how do we move this in a direction where robots complement people instead of replacing people? Now, that's a very interesting question, because there's robotic work being done at MIT where a person who used to have a pick-and-place job on an assembly line, which you used to need people to do that, programming a robot in a traditional way to do that essentially required programming skills. Well, what Rodney Brooks at MIT has done with a robot called Baxter is build a robot that, instead of being programmed to do stuff, you move its manipulator through the process, and essentially you teach the robot how to do this stuff, and now one person who used to be a pick-and-place operator and standing on their feet all day, and some of these people are getting a little old, and young people don't want these jobs, but now that person is supervising a crew of 5 robots without needing to be a programmer to do that. And so they are still working. They're more valuable than they were before. They're not on their feet making repetitive motions all day, which are really bad for the human body. There's so many opportunities to do this in a win-win-win way if you think about how to do that instead of going down a different pathway about how do we build a robot that can replace a person. We can ask a much more interesting question. How do we build a robot that can do very well what people don't do well by taking advantage of human skills combined with robot consistency, robot precision, robot endurance, and stamina? That's a different way of approaching it. And that, if you want to ask a question, how do you become a technology leader in a company today? It's by having your mind open to the possibility that you're about to do something that takes you down one pathway, which makes people irrelevant, when there might actually be higher ROI in going down a different pathway that augments people instead of replacing people.
Yeah, it's a corporate responsibility, right?
Well,
To a
Henry
degree.
Ford said this in a conversation with Walter Reuther of the United Auto Workers years ago when he was showing Reuther the robots in the factories, and Reuther, without missing a beat, said, yeah, but none of those robots is ever going to buy a car. It's ridiculous to build an economy in which you have an Elysium economy in which 5% of the people are the only ones with any money to spend, and the rest are just essentially in this subsistence lifestyle. It doesn't make any sense. Someone, I can't remember who I'm stealing, but someone said, if it's clear that something can't go on forever, then eventually it has to stop. Well, the replacement of people with capital can't go on to the logical extreme of one person owns all the factories. You know the old joke about the factory of the future that has only 2 live creatures in it, a man and a dog?
The dog supervises the man?
Well, the man's job is to feed the dog, and the dog's job is to bite the man if he tries to do anything else. Yeah. This is an ancient joke. But the lights out factory is a reality. And if you've seen the video, for example, of an Amazon warehouse, where the robots run around. They go under the shelves so that they're not in the way of the other robots. Then they go under the shelf, and they kind of spin like a piano stool to lift the shelf. Then they go out into the highway and bring the entire shelf rack to the human worker, and they did this video where a person is reaching out their hand into empty space and a product appears in their hand and they put it into the box. See, this is the experience we're trying to give the human, is that they essentially just put their hand out and the thing they're supposed to put in the box is there.
Let's find that video and put it in the show notes.
It's a great video, but the complementarity of what people do and what the robots do, it's how Amazon's warehouses work. And I show people that video in combination with a great video of a Tesla factory building Model S's, where a robot reaches out, picks up a specific tool with suction cups on it, uses that tool to pick up a windshield, moves the windshield perfectly around a squeegee that puts out a perfect bead of glue around that edge of the windshield. I mean, you and I wouldn't move the windshield around the glue, but the robot doesn't care. And so it's more consistent to move the windshield to the nearest tenth of a millimeter, then perfectly places the windshield in the car, changes its tool, picks up the entire seat, twists it, puts it into the interior, plunks it down. I mean, if I remember correctly, there were 3,200 robots and 1,600 workers in this factory. Okay, that's still plenty of human jobs. But the people are doing things like pop the little cover on the steering wheel with the Tesla logo on it. The robots are doing all the stuff that involves strength and precision. And they're putting out a very high-quality vehicle because they were able to start with a clean sheet of paper. How we design these systems so that they take advantage of what people do, and this is what Gary Kasparov has said about chess. You may remember this from my keynote last year, that the freestyle chess games that combine human and software teams, the teams that are winning those matches are not the ones with the best chess players and not the ones necessarily with the best chess algorithms, but they are the ones with the best process. So if you're using 2 or 3 different pieces of chess playing software and they're recommending slightly different moves, if you're really, really good, you've built a processor where you can say, okay, those 2 moves together show us an opportunity that we can do. This is important. This is important because the bottleneck for AI, I was involved in AI research 30 years ago in the aerospace community. The bottleneck then was that we thought this was going to be done with people called knowledge engineers who would interview human experts, figure out how they do what they do, code that knowledge into a rule base, and that's how we were going to build expert systems. That's what AI was going to be back then, was expert systems. Well, you could sort of see the wall waiting to be hit by this model when in 1985, Digital Equipment Corporation, may it rest in peace, brought a thing to the International Joint Conference of AI called XCon. This was an expert system that configured all of the boxes involved in delivering a VAX mini computer to someone with all the cables and all the racks and all the power supplies, everything there so that when you put it together, it would actually work. Because depending on your configuration, maybe this cable is a 1-meter cable for you, but it's a 2-meter cable for this other guy who ordered different options, right? And that XCon expert system was considered one of the iconic examples of how expert systems technology was going to take these complex tasks and make them scalable. The next year, after the LA conference in 85, DEC was at the, if I remember correctly, Seattle conference in 86, with the tool they built to maintain the knowledge base used by XCOM, which turned out to be a far more difficult and complicated system than the one that used the rules. Maintaining the rules turned out to be phenomenally more difficult to do. And that's how you could see that the scalability of this approach was just not going to be what it needed to be. But someone made the observation quite recently when Google built their, I think they called it GoBot, their program that plays Go at a championship level, which has really never been done before.
Scary.
Very difficult to do. And someone made the two observations. One, if I remember correctly, the second game in a series, the Google software made a move that was so unconventional that the world-class human player that was the opponent got up and left the room for 10 minutes to think about it. It was a completely unexpected move, and someone later said no human being would ever have made that move.
And it was a genius move.
It was an amazing move.
Yeah.
It was considered to be just an astonishingly brilliant move, and not one that any human probably would have made. But the comment was made. IBM's Deep Blue became a championship chess player by being taught by human chess players. Google's GoBot became a world-class Go player by playing against copies of itself and learning at an extraordinary pace, not by being taught by humans, but by playing against copies of itself and evolving novel strategies. That is not the way we were doing AI 30 years ago. It's completely different from what we thought AI was going to be. That's why we use the phrase now machine learning much more than we use the phrase artificial intelligence.
Your little sponsorship thing is now a lot more scary.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, well,
Machines.
you know,
Machines learning
Skynet
from-
is already here. It just hasn't actually awakened quite yet. Yeah, right. No, but
Let's build a bunker.
Well, okay, this is something that a lot of
Wizard
people
bunker.
don't realize about. I mentioned Tesla earlier, just in terms of the robotics thing, but the self-driving Teslas, that's pretty impressive. It's far more impressive when you realize that if I drive a Tesla down the street, every other Tesla that's driven down that street has contributed to a knowledge base that makes my Tesla have a better experience because it already knows about that pothole, for example. It's not generally recognized that the Model S's are a shared learning network, and every one of them knows what all the others have learned. That's an extraordinary difference between that and what we used to think a self-driving car was going to be. The DARPA Grand Challenge model was, I'm going to build something with cameras and software, and it's going to see obstacles and it's going to steer around them. You know, it's approximately infinitely better not to need to recognize a pothole, but simply to know that 50 yards down this particular street, there's going to be a pothole.
So what happens when the pothole gets fixed or the street changes?
Eventually,
will
cars
learn
stop dodging around it. But drivers of Model S's have, in fact, observed that if they drive the same route, several times a week, they've noticed that it changes its behavior in interesting ways. The first time you have to tell it, no, don't take that off ramp, because at first it thinks that's the road. And the next, after a few days, there's like a barely perceptible wobble of the wheel, where it's almost like it's saying, you still don't want me to do that, do you? The degree to which these things are already demonstrating adaptive learning is quite striking, and at this point I'm on record as saying you will see more meaningful progress in this area in the next 3 years than you have in the past 30. Because we are making qualitative changes in the way that systems learn from experience. Alexa, the Amazon Echo technology,
Right.
is another interesting demonstration, and we in fact are doing demonstrations for customers now where we show the linkage of Alexa voice responses. They call them skills. You don't put apps on an Alexa, on an Echo, you teach it skills. And they're part of a larger cloud of skills. And we are able to link Salesforce actions now to spoken commands and things like, when's my first meeting today? And produces a meaningful and reasonably accurate answer. I'll talk about this in my keynote this afternoon.
This is still that idea from our Dreamforce session, Mark.
Yeah, I actually built a voice command.
Yeah. Well,
for
Alexa,
that.
between Echo and Alexa and the Salesforce for Facebook Messenger product, which is a product, and the Salesforce IQ thing, where now your inbox starts reading your mail and popping up little things like, it looks like this customer has been trying to get you to call for a meeting. Should I offer them one of these 3 available times on your calendar, sir?
Digital personal assistants.
Yeah. And this is just walking into the house like Tony Stark and having Jarvis ask you, what you want made for your dinner that night. We're not quite there yet, but the point is, instead of ease of use, which used to be the goal, now we want next best action to take. And the thought experiment that I urge customers to conduct is, if I could take the top 30 or top 50 or top 70% of your company and have them all now functioning at a level of consistent adherence to best practices, immediate recognition of common situations, and perfect attention and consistency to detail, would that be worth something to you? Because that's an achievable goal. Making the top third work as well as the top 10th is something we can do pretty much now. Making the top 9/10ths work as well as the top 10th is something we're going to be able to do in a matter of single-digit years. And it's going to elevate the value of those people. I'm not talking about putting people out of work, because you know what? This is, again, I'm kind of giving you a little bit of an ankle on the keynote I'm going to do today, but someone wrote a really good piece quite recently saying, if you want to live in the future, live in the luxury marketplace, because what's a luxury today is going to be what everybody expects to be able to afford in a relatively small amount of time.
Look at cell phones.
And this is, in my opinion, a far more optimistic outlook than, oh my God, it's going to be the Elysium movie, where a tiny handful live in orbit and everybody else is living in a garbage dump in Mexico, which in fact is where they filmed those scenes. That was an actual set. They didn't have to Photoshop that. They just put a bunch of people into a garbage dump and had them pretend to be robot workers. The opportunity to say, we can all, well, remember when the iPhone came out, or the iPad, and that was considered a toy for the rich originally, and now it's extraordinary the number of people who have a shopping cart to hold everything else that they're pushing with one hand and a smartphone in the other. It's probably an Android phone, not an iPhone. I'll be mentioning this today. You need to think about these things not so much as devices as they are nodes of an ecosystem of revenue, because the average iOS device represents a $52 a year revenue stream, while the average Android device is more like $5. People buying Android are people looking for a cheap smartphone, and people buying Apple are people looking for access to what they think is a top-tier ecosystem. I'm generalizing.
Sure.
I'm generalizing. But the numbers do not lie. The iOS device owner, if you know nothing else except it's an iOS device compared to an Android device, the odds are that's a much fatter, juicier revenue target. And this is something that I did the math on this recently. If Apple were to stop selling hardware tomorrow and merely continue to be the custodian of the revenue stream of iTunes, iCloud, and App Store, that revenue stream to everybody in that ecosystem is a business bigger than Coca-Cola, and Apple's cut is a bigger business than Starbucks. And that would be if they just closed all the Apple stores tomorrow and just continued to supervise the revenue from the devices that are out there in the world today. That's a profoundly different picture of what Apple is as a business than I think most people have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, is it just me, Mark? Do you kind of feel that Peter maybe implied that we're cheap because we're Android users?
No, I don't think that's what he meant.
Okay.
Brian.
I said it's two different bell curves, but the mean of one is a little bit higher than the mean of the other. Now
I was going to say it's a spot-on observation. Personally,
it would be kind of like saying what might also be perfectly accurate. It might be that the average person driving a stick shift is lower income than the average person driving an automatic, and yet some people driving stick shift are driving Lamborghinis. So, you guys may be Android users because you just like the flexibility it provides. I suspect that's the case.
That's exactly it.
More technically oriented people gravitate toward Android because they feel they have more control of their environment. They don't have a sticker on their forehead.
Yeah. And I have more money then to spend on other things.
Exactly. So yeah, it's really important. It's really important not to let statistics blind you. The problem, of course, I mentioned that I work with some universities. I also had an opportunity to help a university design its MBA program. And one of the questions they asked me, I think it was almost a litmus test, they said, do we have to teach calculus to MBAs? And I said, this may be a trick question, but if you're giving me a choice, I'd much rather see future managers be solidly grounded in stats than in calculus. Because there's nothing like someone who knows calculus to come up with a perfectly optimized answer to a really stupid question, as opposed to stats, which will tell you, you know what, the data that you think you've gotten from that market research is absolutely meaningless, a meaningless result with no statistical significance. Is this anything like the conversation you guys thought you were going to have with me today?
Actually, yes.
Very close.
Yes.
Okay, cool.
And we're going to have to leave that at
we're in
that.
the wrap-up, I believe. So, you got one more question you wanted to make sure I got hit.
I don't know if we have time.
I think we don't have time.
People waiting outside.
Yes.
All right. I would love to, believe me.
All right.
So now this is the real test. Can I do this without flubbing live?
Oh, boy. Here we go.
Ready? WizardCast is produced by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, directed by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, technical administration by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, script writing by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, audio editing by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, website maintenance by Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, catching Pokemon. Oh my God, there's one right there! Brian Kwong and Mark Ross, and our intern to this episode was Corinne. Thank you, Corinne.
Thank you, Karen. Send us your interview suggestions, jokes, videos, tips, and feedback to wizardcast@thewizardnews.com, or head over to thewizardnews.com and click Contact WizardCast.
Don't forget to subscribe to the WizardCast and receive our next episode automagically. Once again, I'm Brian.
And I'm going to go get this Charmander. There's one right outside.
Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you very much, sir.
All I did was show up and answer your questions, so you're perfectly welcome.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah. Well, I
Anybody
know,
who's supposed to be
I could
monitoring.
say F word, F word, F word a few times to see if
That's
that
true.
brings adult supervision into the room.
Well,
F word, F word, F word.
That's not what I meant.
It's Andy Betcher, so I'm
That
not
is
sure
not what I
adult
meant.
supervision is appropriate.
Okay.
It's not an appropriate term.
Well, besides, aren't you in charge? You're wearing the hat.
It's technically my podcast.
Well,
Kind of. It's on my website.
It's not so much a badge of office as it is just kind of embarrassing.
For who?
there's a lot of overlap.
Good
here, don't
question.
you think?
Well, badges of office.
Badges of office and things that are vaguely embarrassing.
They're vaguely embarrassing.
That's the thing. I already know I'm vaguely embarrassing. I own it.
See.
But yeah,
So there's
I'm the
nothing
one that
vague
wears the
about
hat.
it. No, you are crisply
I'm
embarrassing.
crisply.
Affirmatively, even defiantly,
Oh, there we go. Defiantly embarrassing.
vigorously, and with both precision and depth.
I think my wife would agree that I am defiantly embarrassing.
Let's make sure we get that on the record. Every now and
That
then.
sounds like my kid. That freaked me out for a
Wait,
second.
another baby in this podcast? How is that possible?
No, that was just my ringtone.
I actually had for my ringtone the sound of my little baby's giggling, which sounded more like crying for about a year and a half.
Well,
before I lost the phone.
it has been found that sounds with the characteristics of an infant cry, it's like your brain is essentially hardwired to respond to it. It's meant to be difficult for you to ignore the sound of a child.
On the other hand, that's a somewhat disturbing tell about a person
Yes?
when their ringtone is the sound of an infant's distress.